Hello and welcome back to another video. In this video, I'm looking at consumer surplus. Where do you find consumer surplus in the specification, GCSE or A-level? You'll find it under the heading of demand. And of course, as its name suggests, it's associated with consumers. So what do we mean by consumer surplus? Well, as you can see, it's the difference between the price paid by the consumer and the amount that they would be willing to pay. You may know already that the demand curve shows us a consumer's willingness to pay for a good or service. Another way you might want to think about this might be in terms of the utility received by the consumer. And in this instance, in terms of consumer surplus, there is a surplus. The consumer is receiving utility over and above what they actually have to pay for. So let's have a look at this in terms of our diagram. You may recall, if you've already watched the video on producer surplus, that there's a certain golden rule for remembering how to identify surpluses on diagrams. In this instance, when we're looking to identify the consumer surplus, we'd be looking for the area above price and below demand. And that's really a golden rule that you should all learn. So consumer surplus is equal to the area above P, price, and below D, demand. And if you can keep that in your head, you shouldn't go far wrong. So let's have a look at this simple example. Here we have our downward sloping demand curve, D1, and I've already indicated point A, where price is P1 and quantity demanded is Q1. So what is the consumer surplus area in this instance? Well, if we stick to this golden rule, ladies and gentlemen, it's the area above P and below D. And so obviously, we'd be thinking of this triangle. That would be the area of consumer surplus in this particular instance. Now, why is that a surplus payment? Well, you can see that in this instance, Q1 units are demanded at a price of P1. But actually, if you ask this particular individual, how much are you willing to pay for the first unit? And there I'm using that phrase, willingness to pay, which I shared with you here, willingness to pay. How much would the consumer be willing to pay? Well, for the first unit, we would go all the way up to the demand curve, and that would give us the consumer's willingness to pay. So they'd actually be prepared to pay, say, P2. But how much do they actually pay? They're only actually paying P1. And so there's a surplus there. And that, in this instance, is the consumer surplus. Now, you can see in this instance that as we move away from zero, as we move away from the origin, so moving in this direction on the diagram, the willingness to pay is dropping, and therefore the consumer surplus on each additional unit is also dropping. And when we now get to point A, we see that the willingness to pay is equal to the actual amount paid. So for P1, Q1 units, we can see that the entire consumer surplus area is, as I've already said, area above P and below D. So what about in an exam or a multiple choice question where you might be asked to identify maybe a consumer surplus area or perhaps more likely a change in consumer surplus? So let's have a look at that on another diagram. So here you can see I have increased the price. So the price has risen from P1 to P2. So I'm just going to put my direction of travel arrows on there. And the quantity demanded is falling from Q1 to Q2. And we've got this contraction, if you will, from A to B along the demand curve. I'll just add one more label, and that will then enable us to identify all of the things that you would be expected to be able to do either on an essay question or perhaps more likely a multiple choice question. So let's add some text here. So let's consider, first of all, the original consumer surplus. What does that equal in this instance? So our original price, as you can see, is P1, and we're looking above price, below demand. So our original consumer surplus will be P1 to A to C. So it's that large triangle. So we'll just add that in, P1, A, C. The price then rises to P2. So what's our final consumer surplus? So because the price has gone up, obviously that narrows the gap between actual price and willingness to pay. And so you would expect, wouldn't you, that the consumer surplus area will fall. Does it fall? It does, of course. So now the consumer surplus area is P2, B, C. So it's that much smaller triangle. So final consumer surplus, P2, B, C. And oftentimes what you'll be asked to do in an exam is to identify the change in the consumer surplus. So the change would be, we've gone from P1AC to P2BC, so the change is clearly this area. And just to add some labels to that, we'd be looking at P1, A, B, P2. And that would be the change in consumer surplus. And in this case, of course, that would represent a reduction in the consumer surplus. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it for now. See you next time. Bye for now.